Lovebirds is a new Netflix original film that was originally going to go to theaters, that was going to be distributed by Paramount, but instead, the COVID-19 happened, and now Paramount has sold it off to Netflix to just stream everywhere starting today. And this movie is about two lovebirds. I say that with quotes because we pick up with them at the very end of their relationship. They've been together for 4 years, and things have gotten really rocky. They aren't exactly the best of chums anymore, and when they're about to break up in the car, they hit a bicyclist, and then Paul Sparks, pretending to be a cop, comes up and says, "Hey, I'm gonna commandeer your vehicle," kills that guy, and then leaves them at the scene of the crime, and they think they're gonna get blamed for it, so they go on the run to try to solve this murder for themselves before the cops arrest them and accuse them of a crime they did not commit. I remember the first time I saw this trailer, it was in front of a movie, I don't remember which one, but all of a sudden this trailer started to play, and I was like, oh, Kumail Nanjiani and Issa Rae are in a movie together? That's kind of cool, let's see what this is. Then the trailer started to play out, and I was like, oh, I don't really know how to feel about this. It doesn't, I hope it plays out well, but it just doesn't look like it's gonna work out the way it wants to. I just didn't really have that much high hopes for the movie. Didn't look like it was gonna really stick with me. It kind of made me a little bit more enthusiastic to see that the director previously did The Big Sick, but The Big Sick is a more heartfelt kind of movie. It's based off of Kumail Nanjiani's real life story, so that I think automatically has a lot more heart to it and a lot more depth. And then you see something like this, which seems like it's probably not gonna have that, and it's just gonna be focused a lot on wacky antics during this kind of dark but ultimately comedic kind of story. And I just watched it like an hour ago. I got ready for this review, and I'm ultimately happy that it did go to Netflix, because I don't know how well it would have done in theaters, because even though the budget is $16 million, when you're competing with a bunch of other bigger movies, especially since this one was supposed to come out like around the same time as like Trolls World Tour and stuff like that, so it probably makes more sense to put it on a streaming platform like Netflix. And ultimately it kind of makes sense too, because the movie, it doesn't really give me like a theatrical vibe. Like after it, I didn't feel like I just watched a movie that was supposed to go to theaters. I was like, no, this feels kind of right for like a Netflix thing. Not saying it's like cheap or anything, but storytelling wise, it does definitely feel a little limited. And it definitely isn't as like hilarious as maybe they thought it was at the end of the day. I will give this movie this: Kumail Nanjiani and Issa Rae have wonderful chemistry with each other, and I really like the setup for this movie. It has a really great premise to get us kicked off. You have this couple, Jabran and Leilani, they hook up and they have a really great time. You see all the sweet moments together in a montage, and then it cuts to 4 years later, and you're just in the thick of it. They're arguing over little things that are really warping into bigger things about their relationship, and you get little details that show you who these characters are and kind of what they're all about before they set off on this, wacky dark adventure. And that was a really good way to get you introduced to this movie, I think. And they also really bounce off each other really well, whether it's their arguments when they're really heated against each other, or when you have more smaller moments and they're trying to find that spark again as the movie continues, and they're sharing little small comedic moments with each other like that. I think that's when I actually really started to like the movie, was when it actually kind of toned down and you just got to see these two characters interact again in a way that was kind of like, oh, that's kind of sweet, they're taking this downtime to be sweet with each other, that's fine. So this movie isn't completely humorless, it doesn't have a completely bad idea for a story. After the movie ended, I saw ultimately where it was going. I was like, that's not a bad idea at all, especially a third act, not twist, it's not a twist or anything, but it's kind of a reveal like, oh, by the way, this. And it was something that I was thinking about, like at the beginning of the movie, I was thinking like, isn't that kind of an exaggeration because this? And they were like, hey, by the way, this. And I was like, okay, yes, that's really funny. They have some moments where I was definitely chuckling. And also one other positive to add on to it, the score, I don't know who did it, but it had a nice synth sound to it. It sounded like they were trying to do their own version of like Game Night, not just like the movie, but like this score specifically. And it did sound pretty good. I wouldn't say it's as good as Game Night, because that's Cliff Martinez. But overall, it had a nice sound to it, and it accompanied the movie very well, I thought. But ultimately, I did think this movie just kind of ended up just okay. First of all, just a nitpick I have with a lot of comedy films, but in this one it's really present, is that you can tell when they're improvising sometimes. There's like this one part where Kumail Nanjiani mentions the Bad Boys song, like, hey, you know that lyric, bad boys, we're the bad boys, and then just Issa Rae mentions like another song, and it felt like the scene was building to like they're just mentioning songs back and forth with each other, but Kumail like immediately cuts her off like, are we just saying songs that we like now? What's going on? It's like, okay, that's clearly like a attempt at a riff that didn't really work out, I think. And then you have other moments as well, and this is kind of common with a lot of comedy films, is that sometimes the editing's a little choppy, like the continuity isn't always perfect. If you're really paying attention to it, like it's something I do, you'll notice like when they cut to a different angle of it, they'll be like in a completely different position, or their face will be a little different. And that sometimes bugs me, but I know that's not gonna bug everyone. But I guess what I mainly want to point out is that sometimes you can tell when they're ADRing in lines, like one point the two characters, they just fall over and they're like, oh, but then all of a sudden you hear Kumail Nanjiani's voice speaking very clearly as if he was like standing up and nothing happened. But they were throwing in a joke because they're off camera, it's like, okay, we could throw one in, but it didn't really sound right. It didn't sound right, and it was just one of those things, like, if they're not on camera, but you hear a funny line being said, then more than likely it's probably ADR. There's that moment in the trailer where Gibran and Leilani, they end up in a barn and they're being tortured, like, hey, do you want bacon grease to the face, or do you want to see what's behind this door? And there's actually a little argument between, like, which one is going to be worse, which was kind of a cool idea, just to have those two, like, well, let's do the grease because I don't mind scars, why not? I don't want to find out what's back there, but, like, no, grease is painful. But then, of course, Gibran gets set up in front of the door, they open it, it's a horse, just kicks him, and obviously that's really painful, and it could probably injure someone more than how it actually injures Gibran in the movie, but, you know, he's hurt. But then all of a sudden he just goes like, take the grease! And I thought it would make more sense, like, just for these characters if he was still like, still better than the grease or something like that, because a lot of this movie is them bickering with each other because they're not exactly friends, but they're in this situation together, they have to work it out together. And in this moment they're also against, like, I'm for what's behind the door because I don't want grease, I want grease because I don't want to find out what's behind the door. And especially since in the context of this movie, a kick to the chest is like, oh, you get a big bruise and it's gonna hurt a lot. But his argument was grease is gonna leave a bunch of scars and that's gonna, like, sting for a long time. So I just thought that was a moment where they didn't really think out their humor. They just thought, like, oh, he really wanted the grease instead of being kicked, how funny. I think more so than just I didn't find him saying that line all that funny, I'm thinking more so, like, the characters in this moment, I think it would have been funny if they were still at odds with each other even after Kumail Nanjiani gets kicked in the chest. This movie also suffers from, like, a too simple kind of problem, where you don't really feel any threat from, like, an antagonistic force. You definitely tell that there is an antagonist. Paul Sparks is very obviously the villain in this case, but it's not like you have a lot to get behind him as a character, and it's not like you see him that much throughout the movie to really fear him. You recognize, like, oh, he's a ruthless killer, but Kumail Nanjiani and Issa Rae kind of easily, like, get out of situations, so it's kind of like, I don't really see what the threat is. Like, the obvious joke here is that these are two average people in a plot that is way bigger than they ever could have imagined being involved with. But it seems like they're able to get out of stuff so easily that it's like, I don't really know, like, are you trying to have tension here, or are you just doing for laughs? Like, this is all for laughs? And it just seemed like the movie probably should have been trying to push, like, a intensity just a tad bit more. I mentioned it earlier, but something kind of like Game Night, where it's really funny, but the threat is there, and you're not particularly thinking, like, oh, these characters are gonna get out of it. Like, there's certain moments where you're like, I don't know if everything's gonna turn out okay. I mean, I hope so, but who knows? And it just seems like they were just more focused on, like, the easy way out of things, just keep it focused on the more funny aspects of it, as opposed to this stuff is actually kind of dark, and you could do a lot with this story if you kind of push that angle a bit more. For example, there's a scene where Gibran and Leilani, they have to sneak into an apartment, and when they get into it, they realize that there's a bunch of frat guys, like, across the hall, but they're making so much noise that they can't hear them in this room, but then a guy walks in and they get into a fight with him, but they still can't hear just because the music is too loud. And it's like, you know, it would be really cool if this scene was, like, actually, like, well made and kind of suspenseful, but instead they're going the most easy way out of it, you know? Like, oh, well, they can't hear us because of the music, so we can literally do whatever. We can scream, we can punch this guy, we can fight, you know? And I was like, given what this movie seems like it's trying to do, it seems like it's held back because you wanted to emphasize the funny, but it's just kind of poorly staged. Like, they're trying to emphasize the importance of staying hidden, but they're looking out the door, still looking at the guys, and none of them turn around to see them, so that's good. But at no moment it feels like these characters are, like, being caught, like, poking their heads out, just getting tiny glances. Like, they're, like, full out by the door. And at one point, Leilani's like, okay, I'm gonna walk out and grab this thing right now. And Gibran's like, dude, they're not looking at us now, but if you walk out there, they're gonna see it. And she's just like, oh, they can't hear us, so it's fine. And it's like, okay, that's stupid, but how is the logic sound of they can't hear us while we're in this room, so you can just walk out, like, near them even closer to grab this thing? Like, it's so stupid. Without spoiling it, the scene kind of escalates, and they still use that room logic of they can't hear because of the music, even though more loud stuff, louder than the music, is happening. But, you know, we can't have that. And there's also a point where Issa Rae she's bust her shoes, so she has to walk in, like, kind of barefoot for a second, and there's glass on the floor, but they don't even really mention that. I was expecting that to happen, like, stepping on the ground, oh, glass, but they didn't do that, and I was like, I thought that seemed like it was such an obvious thing to do, but they did not. And they just kind of move on quickly. You could have probably made a little bit more of an interesting movie as well, but, you know, they had to keep it moving. It's only, it's under an hour and a half, so we got to keep things moving. And it also kind of cuts off, like, their friend group. Like, at one point, they have to go to this party to get something from one of Leilani's friends, and Kumail Nanjiani just kind of states, like, I don't like this guy because he looks at you funny. It's just something he randomly inserts now of all times to finally kind of say something. And it kind of gets resolved like 2 minutes later when you find out the guy's not actually that bad a guy. And he even says something to kind of warm up Kumail Nanjiani's heart of it too. And it just doesn't help that these friends are clueless to the fact that these two are acting incredibly suspicious when they walk in. They have I don't want to spoil it, but they need something from this guy, but they need to create a scenario around it because they can't just outright ask for exactly what they need, because then, oh no, we're going to be busted for a crime. But they're just, they act so suspicious, and that's something that bothered me too, is that in any moment when they're trying to blend in or be natural, they do the most suspicious thing possible. It's like, oh god, like even when they're explaining it after they get caught with this body in front of their car, they didn't do it obviously. But of course the first thing that Kumail Nanjiani is going to mention is that he hit it first, and then just kind of stop speaking and let the other people go like, what, you hit him? And then go like, oh wait, no, I'm explaining it wrong. And they're talking over each other. There's many scenes where they just start yelling over each other. And there's probably a sense of improv to that too, where it's kind of like keep talking over each other, make it seem like it's going to turn into an argument, but you're just like loudly saying stuff. It's like, just tone it down a lot, because nothing you're saying is particularly funny, and it makes these characters look like thundering dumbasses, which in a way they kind of are, but not in a way that feels kind of normal, in a way that you just kind of get aggravated, like, oh, come on. It's not a situation of, well, I wouldn't do this. It's an example of no one, like, ever would do this. Not just me. No one would probably do this. So overall, this movie has some shining moments in there. The chemistry between the two leads is enough to be sorta entertained in a couple scenes. Score's good, but much better than I thought. And it doesn't have a bad idea for a story. It's just the way they went about telling this story, the way they inserted jokes when it seemed like it was way too much and they needed to tone it down, or it seemed like they don't need a joke here, but we're gonna put one in anyway. It just didn't really work for me overall. Maybe that's just a problem with me though, like the way I watched this movie, just thinking like, ooh, you have this interesting thriller side of it. I wish that emphasized it just a tad bit more to actually be evenly balanced with the comedy. Maybe that's just me, maybe no one else will have a problem with that. If so, watch this movie. If you're a fan of both these guys, you'll probably really like this movie. But I'm a fan of these two, but I just didn't really think it was all that funny. I'm gonna give The Lovebirds a C. I definitely don't think it's as good as The Big Sick, the director's previous work, and I definitely think this story could have been a lot better. But if you're just looking for easy laughs and you're a fan of these two, then I guess I could recommend you watching this, since it's on Netflix, and if you have it, then it's totally free for you. But I'm definitely glad it didn't end up in a theater, because it probably wouldn't have done that well. So at least it has an audience here, and it can be on the trending like top 10 for a bit. But I have no real desire to ever see this movie again. It was fine for a first watch, but it was like, I wish it was a lot better, because the potential is there. But if you've seen The Lovebirds, leave in the comments below what you thought of it. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe. I'm Jackson Fulcher. See you guys next time.